Well, hey guys and gals, we are live on Boomer TV. I am Andy Asher, editor of bloomerboomer.com, and our featured guest is American-based foreign correspondent Ivor Davis, who in the summer of 1964, when the Beatles took America by storm and in fact changed rock and roll forever, Mr. Davis served up the stories behind the stories as only an insider can. Author Ivor Davis is coming up in a moment. Now, September is really big here at bloomerboomer.com as we have kicked off the first full season of some new shows with some amazing guests and featured hosts and thought leaders and authors and visionaries. You know, they share their breakthrough discoveries for all of us who are over 55. Now, all the shows, they are live and they are open for your questions too. So if you prefer to binge watch at your own convenience, simply visit your favorite featured host custom webpage at bloomerboomer.com. And in the meantime, you can be part of this amazing journey with the Bloomer Boomer community. Just register on the website for our newsletter, and then you're going to qualify for member benefits as well. Right after this, the author of Beatles and Me on tour with Ivor Davis. Well, hi, Ivor. It is great having you back for episode, I think it's number two here. It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me. Yes, it is episode 2.
All right. Well, in episode 1, you talked about your book, Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. Now it's about you and the Beatles on tour. Those were huge stories back in the day. And at the time, did you have any inclination of how they would, affect history today?
To be honest with you, the answer to the question is no. I was a young journalist working for the London Daily Express. I was running their West Coast of America bureau. And I got a call from the editor in London who said, get on the plane to San Francisco. He said, the boys are coming and you're covering them. You're going to travel with them. You're going to eat with them, drink with them. And also you're going to be writing a column for George Harrison. You're going to be his ghostwriter. So I knew very little about the Beatles. And if most of your listeners and viewers know this, we didn't have the communication we have today. So the only way America knew about the Beatles back in 64, which was, believe it or not, almost 60 years ago, was they tuned into a show called The Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed Sullivan had a Sunday night variety show that everybody tuned into. Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, knew that. He went over much earlier, February 1964, met Ed Sullivan, said, you've got to have my boys on the show. Ed Sullivan wasn't wildly enthusiastic, but he said, okay. So they showed up in February 1964 at the Ed Sullivan Show, and 74 million people tuned in to that show. And Brian thought, we're going to go. So 6 months later, I joined the Beatles in San Francisco for an incredible journey that lasted 35 days. I think we did 26 concerts. So it was sometimes 2 a day across America and Canada. And I got to know the Beatles and see what their magic was.
What an experience. Did you say you did ghostwriting for George Harrison?
I did, because George Harrison was supposed to do a column about, wow, this is America, very sort of all shucks folks. But of course, George was a great musician, but not a very good writer. So I had to sit down with him every few days and get his meanderings, his thoughts, his opinions. But unfortunately, George went to bed at 2 in the morning and woke up at 2 in the afternoon, which was way past my deadline. So to be honest, I must admit, I made up the first few columns. George did not like the first few columns that appeared under his name, and he sat down next to me on the private jet that we were traveling in and said, "It's your column under my name is a load of old rubbish. He actually used a stronger adjective than rubbish. I said, George, wake up, tell me what's going on in your mind, and I'll do a better job. He did wake up, he did talk to me, and the column improved. So that was my start with Mr. Harrison, which was not a very wonderful one, but it got better as we went along.
What a fantastic story. Now, let's talk a little bit about how the book, The Beatles and Me on Tour, came to be. Somewhere it must have been tied into their American debut that you were talking about on Ed Sullivan. But now as I think about it, as you explained earlier, that you were on tour with them before Ed Sullivan.
Well, the answer was no. I was based in America. Ed Sullivan was February 1964. By that time, I was in America. Didn't know much about them, heard dribs and drabs. And then 6 months later, in the summer of 64, is when I joined them. So I just knew about the Ed Sullivan Show because I was living in America. But again, as I say, the communication then was not the way it is today. And I always like to say that today, because of the internet and all the rest of it, you can sneeze in San Francisco and me in Southern California can say 3 seconds later, bless you, Andy, because it travels so fast. Not in those days. So I knew very little about them. I just knew they were a successful rock group. I'd seen them on Ed Sullivan. And when I traveled with them, I discovered that they were a sensation. And every concert I went to was a sellout. Every concert I went to, I could not hear a single word they sang because 15,000, 20,000 young women mostly screamed from start to finish. So that was my introduction to the Beatles, listening to the music and not really hearing them sing. And of course, they couldn't hear themselves sing because they were drowned out and they often lost their way. And I remember talking to Ringo and he said he loses his way, but he now has become, Ringo, of course, is on the drums. He lost his way, but he became a good lip reader and he could pick up whatever song they were singing because he certainly couldn't hear them sing.
Okay, that's what he had to do. Yeah, I do remember the Ed Sullivan Show. It was a momentous event, and Now you probably get so many different questions about them, and some are kind of the paparazzi type questions. But I guess I'm going to ask: is it John or Paul? Is there one or the other you credit for their huge success?
Well, I think you've got to give a fairly equal billing to John and Paul, because on the tour, I would go I lived in the next door room to them. They had a big suite at every hotel we went to, and sometimes not such a big suite. And I would go into their room and help myself to their minibar, much to the chagrin of Brian Epstein, their manager, who complained that they were spending too much on the minibar. And I would see John and Paul sitting on the floor with legal pads and sheets, and they were writing music. So the songs they wrote together were the great hits. And so it's very hard, Andy, to differentiate and say, well, Paul was better than John, John was better than Paul. As personalities, as you know, and as the world knows, they were totally different. John was more provocative. He liked to needle you. Paul was a bit more of a, I always say this Irish phrase, not really Irish phrase. He was a schmoozer. He used to bring me a drink on the plane and sit down and talk. John liked to provoke and needle you, but they were both great talents then. And I must just add that later in their careers, Ringo and George wanted to show that they were also great musicians in their own right, because they were overshadowed by John and Paul. So as the world knows, both George and Ringo went on to write their own songs and become sort of stars in their own right post Beatles.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact of how the Beatles' music allegedly fueled the Sharon Tate murders? I don't know if it's all fiction or truth or not, but you're the best person to ask.
Well, I must tell you that in December 1969, I went to a movie ranch called the Spahn Movie Ranch on the edge of Los Angeles, just outside LA. And I went there because I heard about Manson, Charles Manson, being arrested for the murders. You described Sharon Tate and all the rest of the murders. And I thought, well, what goes on here? And I was very fortunate to, when I went to the ranch in December 1969, that many of the members of the family who had not been arrested and charged with murder were still there. And they told me a story I listened to with utter disbelief. And I tell you why. They said that Charlie Manson brainwashed his followers to commit murder by playing them again and again and again songs from the Beatles' White Album. And that Manson claimed that the lyrics in the Beatles' White Album, songs like Helter Skelter, Revolution, Rocky Raccoon, or whatever, things like that, were secret messages to him to tell him that there was a black-white revolution about to take place, and that thank heavens, thanks to the warnings given to him by the Beatles in this album, I know it sounds crazy, but it's the story, that they would escape to the desert while America died in rivers of racial blood. Well, when I heard that story told to me by sober members of the Manson family, I thought, well, this is absolute garbage. I mean, I know the songs, I know the lyrics, I'm familiar with the Beatles. There's no way on earth that the Beatles wrote this. Of course, there wasn't. And yet, in July of 1970, I sat in a courtroom in downtown LA and heard Vincent Bugliosi, the chief district attorney prosecutor, lay out the motive for the murders. And he said the Beatles songs orchestrated what Manson told his people to do. And the Beatles songs were an anthem for a revolution. And I couldn't believe he was using this motive. And of course, he succeeded because as the world knows, everybody was convicted based on that thesis, which to this day, I still feel a kind of crazy. And I must tell you this, Andy, I spoke to John and I spoke to Paul and I had a conversation with Ringo, and they all said that thesis is absolutely ridiculous. And Paul McCartney, who wrote the song Helter Skelter, said, it's a song about a fairground ride up and down Helter Skelter. It's no mission to kill. And so they were very upset that Manson, feeding his followers all sorts of mind-blowing drugs, propagandized the Beatles' music to say that the Beatles were telling him murder was afoot. Even as we talk today, Andy, the whole concept of that is ridiculous, and I still think it's ridiculous.
Wonder what Bugliosi had to do to get out of that. I mean, what was the purpose for him in promoting that concept or that theory?
Well, I think the problem was that Charles Manson never participated in the actual murder of Sharon Tate and her friends. Charles Manson did the following day, August the 10th, 1969, drive with his followers to the house of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, 10 miles from the previous murder scene. And he did go out and he did tie up the LaBiancas, innocent victims, of course. And he did send in his people to kill them. And the idea that was linked was absolutely ridiculous. So the point I'm making is that Bugliosi had to show that Manson, although he wasn't actually killing people, was the man in charge of the conspiracy, because in California, conspiracy to murder carries the same penalty as actually murdering. And he wanted to make sure that Manson would be convicted with the rest of them. It's a convoluted explanation, I know, But believe me, that was the way the thinking went. And as I said, when I heard it, I thought Bugliosi was mad. And at the end of it, I realized he took the right tack because he achieved what he set out to do.
Ivor, can I keep you on here for a few minutes longer and get some questions, frequently asked questions from our viewers? You have a moment?
Of course.
Okay. Okay, we're back, and Ivor, this question is from Darla, and she's wondering if witnesses, if I guess what her question is, did you witness any jealousy between the Beatles towards the Rolling Stones?
I never witnessed any jealousy between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They were around at the same time. But don't forget, Darla, they were very different to the Stones. The Stones were kind of rough and ready. And somebody told me a story. They said, think of the Beatles going to tour America. And they were the kind of guys that young women wanted to take home to meet their family. But the Rolling Stones were a different image. If you took the Rolling Stones home to meet your family, they might burn the house down. So that was a slightly different image.
The bad boys, yeah.
Exactly.
This is from Chris. He says, can you talk about the connection between the Beatles and Elvis?
Yes. In 1965, the Beatles finally got to meet Elvis. They were dying to meet him. John was a great fan of Elvis. He grew up on Blue Suede Shoes and Heartbreak Hotel and songs like that. And Elvis was kind of iffy because don't forget, Elvis was king of the castle. Elvis was numero uno, and the Beatles came along and knocked him off his perch. So the meeting was kind of odd, and they were uncomfortable with each other. The Beatles were in awe of Elvis, and Elvis was kind of a bit uppity, if you like. I mean, they did meet, and it was quite an amazing evening. I was fortunate enough to be there. But I think the Beatles liked Elvis because he was king and because they grew up on his music. Elvis, with time and ability to review it, was jealous because, as I mentioned, they had knocked him off his perch. He was making 3 movies a year. They made 1 movie, Hard Day's Night, and it was a smash hit. So there was a little jealousy going on there. But the meeting was very uncomfortable at first, and then it kind of warmed up.
Yeah. Oh my goodness! I tell you, just hearing these stories from a first-person standpoint, it's just fascinating for me. I guess is the last one. This is from Bonnie, and she asks how the Beatles got along together. Did they spend much time together? And they must have gotten on each other's nerves, she says. That, any time you're traveling around that much, I suppose that's certainly a possibility.
Well, Bonnie, from my observation, the Beatles got along pretty well with each other. I never saw them arguing. They were like, I don't mean to be a fairy story in my answer, but when they did the press conferences, for example, and they did a press conference in every single city, they were like a unified team. They were funny. They finished each other's sentences. They knew each other's jokes, and they got along well. I mean, John had to get along with Paul because they wrote so much music on the road. The other two were a little bit left out of it, but there was no feuds that I ever saw. And don't forget, the key thing was they were all prisoners in their hotel. They couldn't go out. They couldn't travel. They couldn't do a sightseeing. So they were forced to get along with each other. And from everything I saw, they did.
Huh. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, listen, Ivor, we'll get right back. I just want to hear, when we get back, hear about next week's show and about your books. We'll be right back. Well, we're back. Now, listen, I know that I kind of messed up last week because I didn't go in sequence of our shows. So I know I threw this off a little bit, Ivor, but what's planned for next week?
Okay, great. And are we still on?
Yeah. If you can just tell us I know that we this is actually our second show, so we're planning now for our third next week.
Well, I mean, there is so much to talk about the Beatles. I could talk all night long, and some of the funny inside stories. And I like to talk about the fact that the Beatles wanted to meet Elvis, and the Beatles wanted to meet one or two select other people. But everybody in Hollywood came knocking at their door, and very often they tried to avoid answering the knock at the door. So there are some very interesting stories about who they liked and who they tried to avoid.
Oh wow, that's exciting! Oh my goodness, I tell you, you just got so many stories and so much information. I really appreciate it. Anything you want to mention about the books? We have them on your webpage here at Bloomer Boomer. But anything else you want to mention about that?
No, I mean, to be honest with you, the Beatle book is fun. I looked at it again the other day because when you write a book, you don't read it again. And there's some fun stories, the Beatles and me on tour. So if you're a Beatle fan, it's a great book to look at, and there will be stories that you never read anywhere else because I saw them happen. And in my Manson book, in a way, the same thing. I was on the case from day one. My book is called Manson Exposed: The Reporter's 50-Year Journey into Madness and Murder, because I was there every step of the way, from the first day of the murders to the trial, to recapping it all with inside stories and interviews with key people who were involved in the Manson case. So there are totally different books, I must say, Andy, but in a way the Beatles overlap the Manson book strangely, and I didn't plan it that way.
Now, I know some of the people, key characters, are probably not around anymore, but you've I probably kept in touch a little bit, one way or another, with some of these history-making people.
I did, and the other day, so much so, and I won't mention it right now, but one of the youngest Manson family members came and had tea with me the other day. So, and she's now a grandmother. So,
oh, wow. Fantastic. Hey, Ivor, thanks again. It's always great, and I'm really looking forward to the next week at the same time, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andy.
And if you want to be part of the amazing journey with the Bloomer Boomer community, register on the website for our newsletter, and you'll qualify for some member benefits as well. Meantime, so long, and we'll see you next time.